Imagine the opening shot as a map that breathes. At first it's quiet brown steppe, pale desert, a few river threads. Then, in the corner near the mountains beyond the Ciadaria, a small ember flares. Another follows along a caravan road, then another at an oasis. Each week the lights hop forward, not in a straight line but in pulses, caravans leaving on market days, riders swapping horses at relay posts, merchants waiting out a sandstorm and then moving all at once. The map doesn't spread like paint in water. It blinks, hesitates, accelerates. That's what disease really looks like in the world. Not one big wave, but many small breaths. If you press your ear to this map, you can almost hear the machinery under it. The flea, for one, the little engineer of catastrophe working inside its own body. In an infected flea, Yersinia pestis clogs the foregut like wet flour in a funnel. The flea panics. It bites, fails to swallow, and bites again, regurgitating bacteria each time. That blocked foregut is a cruel feedback loop. The hungrier the flea becomes, the more it spreads. Meanwhile, the bacterium itself is not just drifting, it's wearing a toolkit of survival tricks, a waxy capsule against immune cells, syringes of proteins that disarm the body's first responders. Under a microscope, this is where the story begins, a microscopic standoff that the human host doesn't realize is happening for days. Zoom out to the roads. The Pax Mongolica call it the steppes globalization, stitched Eurasia into a single logistics belt. Bandits were suppressed. Milestones and caravanserai were funded like highway rest stops. Post relays, the yam, moved messages across distances that used to eat months for breakfast. The system was built for speed and predictability, exactly what a pathogen loves. It wasn't that the plague decided to travel. It's that we, for the first time in centuries, laid out a clean, well-lit runway from the interior of Asia to the Mediterranean. On your breathing map, the nodes that brighten first are not the most famous cities, but the dependable ones. The water stop with fodder for animals, the relay that always has new horses, the market day that draws farmers from 20 miles around. Logistics is destiny. Then the sea catches fire. Ports are different from caravan hubs. They inhale and exhale on a schedule: tides, winds, convoys. Down in a galley's hold, you don't just have cargo, you have a floating ecology. Grain sacks, hemp ropes, bilge water, the warm dark beneath the planks. It's a 5-star rat hotel. Black rats, ratus, are born climbers. A mooring rope is a bridge, a dangling fender a staircase. They settle in, fleas settle on them, and the whole ship becomes a shuttle bus. Harbour masters in some cities already keep tally sticks for customs, ports have notaries for insurance claims, and guilds post rules about spoiled goods. But no statute says what to do when the cargo is a bacterium. So the ships keep their appointments: Messina, Marseille, Genoa, Tunis, Barcelona, each port a new breath on the map. Disease doesn't spread at a constant speed. That's a comforting myth we tell ourselves because straight lines are easier to draw. The reality is that transmission rises and falls with ordinary human rhythms. Winter closes shutters and brings lungs close together. That's when the pneumonic form plague in the lungs takes short, brutal leaps from breath to breath. Summer brings fleas into their season, and the bubonic form plague in the lymph nodes follows the rat corridors along docks and alleys, into grain lofts and under market stalls. Epidemiologists today talk about R0 as if it were a single number, but the map reminds you it's a choir. Housing density, grain prices, a festival day, a military muster, each voice changes the pitch. And then there's money. If you want to understand why people kept sailing into danger, follow the ledger. Books. Europe in the mid-14th century is buzzing with long-distance trade. Italian banks juggle bills of exchange. Credit is the grease that moves wool from English fields to Flemish looms and spices from eastern markets to northern tables. A ship that doesn't sail is a cascading default. Crews are paid on shares, Merchants borrow against expected cargoes, and insurers, yes, maritime risk is already a thing, calculate premiums with quills that don't include mysterious pestilence in the formula. So captains keep to their roots, even when half a crew is coughing and the other half is praying. Economic history isn't a side plot here, it's the accelerant. The plague rides not only on rats and fleas, but on obligations, debts that demand movement. The laws that do exist are local, practical, and often too slow. A city statute might say where offal can be dumped, or when tanners can boil their vats. Markets have hours, curfews are posted on feast days, guilds regulate who sells what where. None of those rules were written with a blocked flea foregut in mind. Yet within months, you can watch cities start to invent new rules on the fly, color flags to mark sick houses, guards on gates, bans on funerals that draw crowds. In Venice, officials eventually learned to detain arriving ships and people on islands, lazaretti, for a set period. Elsewhere, towns experiment with clean bills of health for departing vessels. The first attempts are messy and inconsistent, but the idea is radical. We can govern a microbe with paperwork and waiting. Look back at the map. What invisible forces link a flea's gut, a ship's hold, and a city statute? Systems. The flea is a system the bacterium hijacks. The ship is a system of trade and labor. The statute is a system of behavior wrapped in law. The catastrophe happens when those systems harmonize in the worst possible way. A pathogen optimized for a vector meets a supply chain optimized for speed and a civic code, optimized for yesterday's problems. There are lesser-known beats in this opening act that change how you see the rest. 1. The outbreak's earliest sparks likely sit not in the great imperial capitals, but in unglamorous nodes, way stations whose names barely survive on old lists. 2. Early public health often starts as crowd control and logistics, not medicine, corpse collection, schedules, trench locations, gate protocols. 3. The waves are layered. In the same city, winter deaths can be driven by breath-to-breath transmission behind closed shutters. Summer spikes can track along the waterfront and granaries as fleas find their stride. If you only look for one signature, you miss half the score. And to be fair to the people in this map, they are not passive. Chronicle is right because memory is a tool. Priests ring bells not just for the dead, but to tell the living something is happening. Councils argue over closing markets. Neighbors jury-rig solutions, vinegar, washes, smoke fumigation, crude distancing. Some of it doesn't work, some of it does. The important thing is that the map is not only lighting up with death, it's learning. The next time a ship arrives with a suspicious crew, the conversation is a little shorter. The next time a cartload of grain appears from a stricken village, someone asks a different question. Reinvention begins as rumor and hardens into ordinance. If you're squinting and seeing modern outlines here, you should. Swap caravans for cargo jets, galleys for container ships, guild statutes for building codes, and the breathing map looks familiar. Just-in-time logistics still prize speed. Cities still have blind spots, ventilation in winter, overcrowding in summer. Law still plays catch-up to biology. Our dashboards are prettier than a monk's ledger, but they also blink, hesitate, and surge for the same reason. Human systems breathe in patterns. The Black Death's first lesson is not medieval, it's structural. So in this series, we'll let the map keep breathing while we test legend against lab, siege tales against shipping logs, miasma against microbiology, sermons against statutes. We'll watch Yersinia pestis pass its microscopic baton to a starving flea, to a rat on a rope, to a customs officer with a tired stamp, and then to a council that decides to invent a new kind of waiting. This is not just the story of how millions died, it's the story of how a bacterium found a whole civilization mid-stride, and how that civilization, stunned, learned to change its stride. Ready? Let's follow the first light. Ground Zero revisited. Cemeteries on the Silk Road. Picture a quiet valley where the mountains fold like sleeping animals and the wind smells of dust and wild thyme. Traders have been using this corridor for so long that the road feels worn even when it's empty. On the edge of a village, a little cemetery sits behind a low wall. The stones are modest local, limestone, simple crosses, and carved rosettes, and the inscriptions are not in Latin or Arabic but in Syriac, the liturgical language carried here by far-traveling Christians who followed trade as faithfully as any pilgrim path. Two dates repeat across several stones, 1338 and 1339. Another word repeats too, always in the same spare, devastating phrasing. Pestilence. These are the graveyards of Kara-Jigak and Burana in the Chu Valley of what is now Kyrgyzstan, a few days' ride from the Tian Shan. They are not famous ports or imperial capitals. They're the sort of places where history happens between ledger entries, where a caravan stops to water animals and a clerk hurries to keep up with his receipts. And that's exactly why these stones matter. They're not propaganda, they're not court chronicles, they're not hearsay gathered decades later. They're simple, local, and heartbreakingly specific. So-and-so, son of so-and-so, died in the year 1649 of the Greeks, that is, 1338 of pestilence. For years, these inscriptions were like an echo with no source. Pestilence could mean many things. Plague, yes, but also smallpox, typhus, any of the killers that travel with people and scarcity. The Silk Road is a contagion highway not because it is mystical, but because it is logical. Where traffic is dense, risks pool. Still, we didn't want to guess the pathogen just because the story was tidy. Folklore loves a neat origin. Science should be grumpy about neatness. Enter the part of the story that plays out under a microscope and inside a sequencer. A small team returns to those stones not to read them, but to listen to the teeth below. Molars, especially, are good historians. The blood supply to the pulp chamber can trap microbial DNA during a systemic infection. If someone died with bacteria raging through their bloodstream, fragments of those invaders can be entombed in the tooth like a crime scene sealed with enamel. Carefully, cleanly, the team samples a handful of individuals from those 1338-39 graves, builds libraries from the powder, and fishes for genetic scraps that match known suspects. The screen lights up, Yersinia pestis. And not just any Y pestis, but genomes that sit on a very particular branch of the plague family tree. Think of the bacterium's history as a subway map. The Justinianic pandemic in late antiquity rides an older line. The Black Death and its successors explode from what geneticists call a polytomy, a big branching event where multiple lines peel off around the same time. The Kara-Jigak and Burana sequences don't just point to plague. They cluster right at the base of that Black Death burst. In plain language, here, in these quiet cemeteries, we're standing frighteningly close to the spark that becomes Europe's inferno a decade later. This is where we should pause and talk about stories we inherited. For a long time, many textbooks nodded vaguely at China as the Black Death starting point. It's not hard to see why. China is populous, historically literate, and frequently at the far end of Eurasian trade graphs. But big and far isn't evidence. Central Asia, this belt of steppe, oasis, and mountain, has always had the ingredients plague likes: resilient wild rodent reservoirs, flea vectors, and human exchange nodes sprinkled just far enough apart to keep sparks alive. When you add the Pax Mongolica's road safety and the Yam postal relays to that ecology, you don't need an imperial capital to make a pandemic. You need a dozen dusty, dependable stops, exactly the kind that dot the Chu Valley. The stones themselves add texture. The names on them are mixed Turkic, Iranian, and Christian, and that tells you the Silk Road truth. No romantic painting quite captures. This was less a single road than a braided marketplace of languages, coins, and customs. Armenians traded here, Sogdian legacies lingered, Nestorian, Christians, those Syriac inscriptions, had been pushing into Central Asia for centuries. Pestilence in such a place doesn't stay in one community. It moves in and out of households that share wells, warehouses, stables, and soup pots. A few dead in autumn, more in winter, then a cluster the next year. From the perspective of a village scribe, it's a season of bad luck. From the perspective of phylogeny, it's the bacterium getting its passport stamped. Let's follow one of those stamps. A trader from the valley may leave with furs and finished textiles, traveling to a caravanserai 2 days away where the bread is good and the night watch is competent. He's fine on departure, a little tired by evening, feverish by dawn. He doesn't know that a flea, starving because its gut is plugged with multiplying bacteria, has taken 3 angry bites and vomited microbes into his blood. He rests a day, then pushes on because that's how trade works when you've borrowed against your cargo and your cousin is expecting the proceeds in Tabriz. Somewhere along the line, he shares a bowl with a man from farther west who's waiting on letters carried by the yam. The network doesn't need an outbreak in a big city. It just needs steady motion and a few unlucky overlaps. Back underground, the lab story gets even more precise. Those ancient genomes carry mutations that act like timestamps, not exact dates, but relative orderings. When geneticists build the plague family tree, they use these differences to see which strains are siblings, which are parents, and which are second cousins twice removed. The Kara Jigak and Burana sequences sit right where you'd expect if the Black Death's European onslaught began from a Central Asian source in the late 1330s. Europe's crash begins in 1347-48. The timing lines up with caravans and relay lines that take months to move goods, but only days to pass infection from one hub to the next. Here's a lesser-known wrinkle. Wild rodents on the steppe aren't just innocent bystanders. Species like marmots and certain gerbils maintain plague in natural foci, with fleas as go-betweens. Hunters and skinners busy, profitable trades bridge those animal worlds to human ones. Pelts are bundled, stacked, sometimes stored with grain to keep them dry. Fleas don't care whether their hotel is a rat on a ship rope or a marmot in a snare. They care about warmth and blood. In a normal year, an unlucky hunter gets sick and the valley mourns. In a year when roads are safe and caravans are fat, the valley mourns and the road carries it away. You might wonder, could those pestilence stones be marking something else entirely, and we've just bent the evidence to fit a good yarn? That skepticism is healthy. But the power of ancient DNA is that it doesn't care about our plot twists. The letters are there, chemically battered, but legible. The genes that make Y, pestis, good at invading the lymphatic system. The sequences that distinguish this lineage from older or later waves. And because the teeth belong to people whose dates are literally chiseled above them, the genomes are anchored in time as well as space. Even better, when you lay these data next to plague genomes from later European graves, say, the Great Pits near London's East Smithfield, you can watch the family lines extend. The tree links the valley to the pit. There's another human detail I love about these stones. They remind us that data points were people with mothers, trades, and favorite jokes. The Syriac language traveled here with faith and commerce. The artisans who carved these words were part of a cosmopolitan lane that knew how to make deals under mountain shadows. The fact that their community had the habit of marking cause of death, at least in that dreadful season, means they were paying attention, taking note, trying to make sense of a run of bad luck. We are not the first to want an origin story, we are only the first to sequence it. So when we say ground zero, we don't mean a single dramatic explosion in a capital city. We mean a set of modest cemeteries whose stones whisper the same word across 2 bad years. We mean a web of way stations where fleas and obligations traveled together. We mean genomes that sit at the root of a branching that would, within a decade, turn into Europe's worst nightmare. The older China first shorthand fades not because China wasn't connected, it was, but because the genetic map lights up the mountains and valleys in between. The launch point is Central Asia, where steppe and range meet route and relay. From here, our breathing map has somewhere to start. A dot in the Chu Valley brightens and holds. A line pulses west. The roads are open. The letters are waiting. And the stones, stoic, sun-bleached, stubborn, are still telling the truth of what came next. Caravans, couriers, and contagion, engines of spread imagine. The steppe as a sea, and the caravans as ships slow, creaking but constant. The Pax Mongolica didn't just make the sea safe, it laid down lanes, built harbors, and posted lighthouses. That's how local animal outbreaks, epizootics, grew legs and learned to cross a continent. Start with a single day on the road. A caravan rises before dawn near a low ridge of feather grass. Camels are loaded by feel, textiles high and dry, ceramics padded, furs layered to keep out moisture. The caravan master checks his wooden tally, debts, consignments, last night's feed. He's not a romantic hero, he's a project manager. By sunrise, the column is moving toward a stone complex on the horizon, a caravanserai. These were the steppes, motels, forts, thick walls, one iron-studded door, a central courtyard big enough for 100 animals, roofed bays for fodder, a well or cistern, and an upstairs gallery of cramped rooms. Some even had a small infirmary and a shrine. The fee bought you a night protected from bandits and wind, a stall for your beasts, and access to the water that mattered more than anything else. Now layer in the Mongol state's postal system, the yam. Think of it as a relay spine running along the trunk routes, with ribs out to provincial towns. Every 25-40 kilometers, a post station kept spare horses and a cookpot. Couriers carried a paisa, a metal tablet engraved with the Khan's authority, which turned them into rolling exemptions, fresh mounts, food, even commandeered help. A good rider swapping horses at each station could cover 200 kilometers in a day, which in the 13th-14th centuries is simply outrageous speed. Tie that to the caravan clock market days, tax collection cycles, tribute convoys, and you suddenly have synchronized pulses of motion across thousands of kilometers. That rhythm is what made microbes lucky. Because microbes don't ask for passports, they hitch rides on habits. Out on the open land, plague is a story that belongs to rodents before it belongs to us. The Eurasian steppe is dotted with natural plague foci, ecological neighborhoods where Yersinia pestis is quietly maintained by hardy wild hosts, marmots, susliks, gerbils. Their fleas pass the bacterium between burrows when densities spike. In a dry year, a cold snap, or after a big breeding season, these rodent towns boom and bust. A hunter takes marmot pelts for the fur trade, popular, profitable, warm, scrapes them clean on a windy afternoon, and drinks from the same water trough as the caravan's drovers. A flea starved by a blocked foregut needs a blood meal now, not loyalties. It jumps from cooling marmot to dog, from dog to man. The bacterium doesn't need to conquer a city. It just needs a bridge that doesn't break. Caravanserais were perfect bridges. They were safe, crowded, and predictable. Picture the evening press. Pack animals steaming, dogs snuffling, children weaving between legs with baskets of stale bread, and onions for sale. Traders arguing in the carved shade of the arcade. A fur broker opening bundles for inspection on a blanket. Bales of grain carried to the storeroom, ropes coiled and stacked. Tack hung to dry. Each object is a flea habitat. Each pause is an opportunity. If a rodent dies in the wall, its fleas go looking. If a cat naps by the granary door, it becomes an elevator for whatever lives in the chaff. Now, add the hubs. The Silk Roads were never a single ribbon. They were a braided network with knots. Kashgar, Samarkand, Bukhara, Otrar, Tabriz, Trebizond, Sarai, on the lower Volga. At these hubs, caravans split and recombined, like trains switching on a vast yard. Goods were re-invoiced, letters were handed to couriers bound for the yam, taxes, tumga, were collected, inns, baths, and stables pulsed with bodies. Hubs amplify everything: prices, rumors, and pathogens. A single infectious person can seed 2 or 3 outward caravans the next week. An infested grain store can turn a block into a rat sanctuary by harvest. It wasn't just the moving parts, it was the schedule. Markets and fairs ran on calendars. Troops rotated garrisons to the same towns each season. Tax caravans assembled after harvest. Envoys traveled with set winter or summer gear. Seasonality matters. In winter, shutters close, breath hangs in the air, and pneumonic transmission, plague in the lungs, finds short, lethal paths between people pooling heat. In summer, fleas are lively, rats are restless, and bubonic transmission, via flea bite, maps itself onto granaries, rope piles, and holdfasts. The network breathes differently in January than in July, and the disease rides those breaths. Communication, the humankind helped and hurt. The yam didn't only carry edicts, it carried news. Bandits on the eastern track, fodder scarce after the last station, a fever in the valleys. That warning function saved lives, but it also guaranteed that travelers headed to safer roads would converge more tightly, sleep in the same overflow courtyards, press at the same gate at dusk. Risk communication is a paradox. It moves people away from danger and thereby concentrates them somewhere else. In the steppe belt, a rumor could reroute a month of caravans like a river diverted into a new bed, scouring deeper, precisely because the flow is sudden. Let's walk one route. Furs and felt from the Altai, dried fruit, nuts, and copper wares from Fergana, Chinese silk and paper from Kashgar, horses and slaves from the steppe, Persian dyes and sugar from Tabriz, all meeting in a city where a new stone bridge has just been dedicated by a governor with a taste for tiled inscriptions. A Nestorian deacon registers a baptism in Syriac, while 2 streets over, a Persian scribe tallies customs in Arabic. Languages overlap like rooflines. In that overlap, fleas don't care what script you favor. They care that your stall is next to the granary, that your bedding is thick, that you will sleep in the same room your uncle used when he traded here last season. What about ships? They matter here too, because the web the Mongols stitched didn't stop at the surf. Volga routes ran north to the Caspian. From there, goods and people jumped to Tabriz, Trebizond, or the Black Sea ports. A plague-sparked caravan could deposit a few sick men at a riverside mart. From there, a boatman, then a dock worker, then a coastal freighter crew picks up the thread. Contagion doesn't respect the line we draw between overland Silk Road and maritime Silk Road. In practice, they were one logistics organism, hoofbeats to oar strokes to billowing lateen sails. Why, you might ask, didn't the empire's order stop it? Weren't there rules? There were Jarlik edicts, tax codes, checkpoints, garrisons, and they did what they were built to do: suppress banditry, standardize weights and measures, speed tribute, protect envoys. None of that speaks the language of fleas. The first public health rules in this world were accidental. An order to hold caravans outside a city gate during a festival to prevent crowding might shave a transmission chain. A posted ban on storing furs inside city walls could reduce flea density without anyone understanding why. But those were side effects. The main effect of Pax Mongolica was security and speed. And for a microbe that thrives on contact, security and speed are blessings. A few lesser-known wrinkles round out the picture. Rodent economies. Marmot pelts were not just for warmth. The oil and meat were also used. Hunters skinned in shared spaces, and belts, boot linings made from fur could carry fleas across seasons. Stable cats and dogs. They controlled rodents, yes, but also served as flea bridges between wild and domestic spaces. A dog that roamed between courtyard and granary could knit two ecological zones into one. Way station architecture. Drains and dung pits outside the walls sometimes attracted rodent colonies. When food scraps piled up, burrows crept toward warmth under the foundation stones. Relay discipline. Couriers with Pisa could override common sense pauses. A sick rider still moved because the badge said so. Authority multiplied exposure. By the time the breathing map reaches the Caspian and the Black Sea, the engine behind it is visible, a logistics web that favors reliability over isolation. Local epizootics in rodent towns do what they've always done: flare, fade, persist. The difference now is that a hunter's flea can meet a dockworker's rope, that a caravan's summer fleas can hand the baton to winter's indoor breath, that a rumor can redirect a month of bodies through a single gate. The Pax Mongolica did not invent plague, it invented a road system that made plague efficient. So when we say caravans, couriers, and contagion, we're not being poetic. We're naming parts of the same machine. The caravanserai is the switchyard. The yam is the express lane. The silk roads are the circuit board. Plague is the current that lights it up. And once the board is powered, the glow does not stay on the step. It moves sure as schedules, hungry as fleas toward the ports, the courts, and, eventually, your street. The Kaffa question: catapults or just commerce? Picture wind coming off the Black Sea and slapping the walls of a crowded, money-hungry port. Genoese merchants pace the ramparts. Steppe riders, Tartar troops of the Golden Horde circle like a dark belt in the hills beyond. This is Kaffa in 1346, a city built for commerce, suddenly trapped inside a war story. The setup is pure siege logic. Kaffa, modern Feodosia, is the jewel of Genoa's eastern trade, a customs house with a skyline, warehouses, bells, cranes, plugged directly into the Mediterranean's appetite. Outside those gates sits an army commanded in the name of Jani Beg, furious over insults, taxes, and the kind of market, brawls that turn into pretexts. The playbook is familiar: choke the roads, block the water, wait for fear to do what battering rams cannot. Then the sick tents multiply in the besiegers' camp. You can imagine how the air changes. At first, a rumor, a fever out by the picket line, a captain gone grey in a day. Soon it's a pattern, men with dark swellings, coughing, collapsing. The soldiers still want the city, but what they have now is bigger than a grievance. They have a pathogen running through tents, cookpots, and saddle blankets. Siege is a perfect petri dish. Crowding, lousy sanitation, hungry fleas looking for new hosts when rats die off, and a lot of exhausted people sleeping close to the ground. Enter the passage you've probably heard. A 14th century account, written far to the west, tells us the besiegers, desperate and enraged, began hurling plague-dead bodies over Kaffa's walls with trebuchets turning rot into weapon. It's an image made for TV. Moonlit engines, creaking, a body arcing against the stars, a sickening thud somewhere in a courtyard. If you're writing a thriller, you stop here and turn up the drums. If you're writing history, you ask harder questions. First, was it physically possible? Sure, medieval armies tossed all sorts of things with counterweight machines, stones, barrels, even beehives. A corpse is heavy, but a big trebuchet can loft it. Second, would that act, by itself, be an efficient way to seed a citywide outbreak? That's where the drama runs into biology. Yersinia pestis spreads best through fleas, especially the rat flea, and, in cramped winter rooms, human to human, via pneumonic droplets. Catapulting already decomposing bodies over a wall is more theatrical than effective. The bacteria in a long-dead cadaver are far less likely to start a chain than living fleas, riding living rats, or living people huddled indoors. Third, how reliable is our storyteller? The famous account comes from someone who almost certainly wasn't at Kaffa. He was relaying a story already rolling west on waves of hearsay, grief, and the need to make sense of the senseless. Siege chronicles love big gestures. Rumor loves a villain with an engine. Even if bodies flew, and it's plausible some did, that doesn't mean those flights were the decisive fuse that lit Europe. Here's the bigger, duller, truer engine of spread: logistics and panic. While the army sickened, Kaffa still had ships. The harbour was deep, the quays well practiced, the clerks quick with their tallies. When a blockade thins, even a little, captains thread the gap. And when death starts knocking inside the walls, whether from fleas slipping through grain stores or contagion carried in by refugees, those ships become lifeboats as well as cargo mules. Some vessels fled north to the Danube mouth and the Black Sea's western ports. Others went south through the Bosporus and out into the inner Mediterranean. Holds were full of textiles and pepper and rats. Ropes thrummed with fleas. Crews coughed below deck in stale air. The plague did not need a trebuchet, it had a timetable. Siege lines, by contrast, are disease multipliers in slow motion. Soldiers on both sides share water sources, foragers drag carcasses back to camp, herds of pack animals stamp the same muddy ground until it's a broth of waste and spilled grain, great living for rodents. When supplies tighten, people eat worse and sleep worse. Immune systems sag, gossip gets louder. They're throwing bodies, they poison the wells. It's a curse. Information networks, soldiers' songs, market whispers, letters sent with couriers spread dread as efficiently as fleas spread bacteria. And dread has a physics. It pushes people onto boats who wouldn't otherwise have sailed and onto roads they might have waited to take. Maritime trade, once set in motion, doesn't stop for tragedy. Contracts don't evaporate because a port smells wrong. A Genoese factor with wool waiting in Majorca has promissory notes tied to freight, leaving the Black Sea. A Venetian competitor is counting on alum and slaves from Crimea and grain from the steppe. If your crew is down 3 men from fever, but your hull is insured and the wind is right, you cast off anyway. Commerce is a better contagion vector than malice. It's punctual. Now, ethics and policy, because even in 1347 there are choices to make. Do you torch a ship with a sick crew to save a harbour? Some city councils flirt with brutal measures. Others simply deny entry until wins or bribes change the calculus. Do you let refugees disembark if the alternative is to let them die within sight of shore? A gate captain has a heart and a family. A harbour official has rules and creditors. Siege makes everything a moral knot. The duty to protect the many tangles with the duty not to condemn the few. There are no quarantine handbooks yet, only instincts and improvisations guard. Boats, waiting anchorages, cargo fumigated with sour smoke that frightens noses more than microbes. Back in the siege camp, the physics of fear work the other way. A commander wants the city to fall before his army does. If he believes hurling corpses will break morale or force surrender, he'll order it, plague or no plague. The trebuchet becomes a theatre of power more than a delivery system for disease. The message arcing over the walls is as much psychological as biological. We're willing to do anything. Inside the city, that message lands with a thud. But what breaks Kaffa is not a single grotesque trick. It's time, rats, and ships. There's a quieter angle most retellings skip. Even without a siege, Kaffa was a biological switchyard. Grain depots, tanneries, rope walks, stables, and cramped dormitories for porters and sailors, each a habitat for rats and their fleas. In good years, it's just background life. Under siege, stocks get moved and hoarded. Smuggling. Tunnels open and close, trash piles where it shouldn't. Cats follow the mice, dogs follow the cats, and fleas follow everyone. You don't need catapults when your city's underbelly, its ordinary ecology, is already doing the work. So what do we do with the famous story? We keep it, but we resize it. It's a vivid shard of a larger mirror. Bodies may have flown, They were not the wings on which plague traveled the world. The decisive spread was powered by siege conditions that magnified transmission, supply chains that moved vectors and hosts, and panicked sailings that connected outbreak to outlet. One spectacular bioweapon moment makes a tidy villain. A web of ships, debts, and schedules makes a convincing model. There's a reason the next ports Constantinople, then Messina, then Marseille light up in quick succession. Those cities were not victims of a single shot fired in Crimea. They were victims of a network primed to turn local disaster into regional pattern. Plague likes momentum more than it likes theatre, and the Black Sea in 1347 had plenty of momentum. If there's a lesson hiding under Kaffa's walls, it's this: beware stories that narrow catastrophe to a single dramatic act. They feel good. They're almost always wrong. The truth is harder and more useful. We built systems armies around cities, ships around sea lanes, contracts around ships that made us efficient. The bacterium simply slipped into that efficiency and rode it. And when the wind shifts, the banners come down, and the siege lifts. Kaffa does what it was built to do. It loads cargo, it stamps bills of lading, it watches masts shrink into the haze. On those decks, fleas are busy. In those holds, rats are scratching. Far away, a harbour master debates what to do when those sails appear: catapults or just commerce. History's answer is almost always the boring one and the terrifying one. Commerce wins. Ports as super spreaders, rats, fleas, and holds. Step off the gangplank and duck your head. Below decks, the air turns sweet and sour grain dust, tar, old rope, a hint of fish. Your eyes adjust to a half-light where everything is texture: stacked sacks with tiny chaff leaks, coiled hawsers as thick as a man's thigh, crates wedged into ribs, a bilge that glitters where lantern oil meets a skin of water. It feels still down here, but it isn't. The hold is a living city. Watch the ropes first. Hemp is a ladder. Black rats, Rattus are built for this gym. Light bodies, long tails for balance, paws that grip fibers like rungs. They cross from quay to deck at dusk, work the rigging, and vanish into the lattice of beams above you. They love edges, where a sack meets a plank, where a beam meets a bulkhead, where a coil of rope leaves a dark pocket. If you were a rat, you'd map the hold as a chain of safe triangles. If you were a flea, you'd map the rats. Now kneel by the grain. Sacks aren't sealed worlds. They leak and sweat. A trickle of wheat becomes a buffet. Rats set up middens under the stacks, gnaw small arcs in the canvas, drag kernels behind a board and eat there, leaving a track of droppings and flea eggs. A single pregnant rat can turn a corner of the hold into a colony within weeks. Add 2 more rats, and you have neighborhoods. The bilge makes it better. Just enough damp to keep air soft, never enough to flood a nest if the ship is tight. Every creak of hull is a lullaby. And on those rats live the tiny villains with perfect timing, Xenopsilla chiopes, the oriental rat flea. Most days, a flea is a simple machine: leap, bite, drink, lay eggs. But plague turns it into something else. When Yersinia pestis colonizes a flea's foregut, it builds a blockage like jam packed into the insect's feeding tube. The flea tries to feed and can't. The blood won't pass. It starves while standing on a banquet. Starving makes it frantic. It bites again and again, sawing with its mouthparts, and in the effort, it coughs back what's jammed up inside, a slurry of bacteria, right into the bite wound. That's the blocked foregut mechanism, biology's cruel feedback loop. The hungrier the flea gets, the more effective a spreader it becomes. Put this loop on a ship, and you get a microeconomy of disease. Rats flourish, fleas flourish, and when rats die in clusters, as they often do when plague rips through a colony, their fleas go hunting. A rope touching a mooring post is a bridge. A coil that warms under a lantern becomes a nursery. A sail stowed in a forecastle is a flea apartment block, with long corridors of canvas. And if the rat population crashes suddenly, hungry fleas aren't picky. They'll test a dog, a cat, even a human ankle when the watch is changed at midnight. Below decks is not dirty by moral failing, it's perfect habitat by design. Up top, the port breathes on a schedule. Tides, winds, convoy windows, market days. That rhythm is why harbors became super spreaders. Ships don't dribble in randomly, they stack. A north wind stalls 3 galleys outside the breakwater, then shifts and brings 10 in at once. The quay bursts porters, scales, tally sticks, crates slamming down, rigging, singing, animals bellowing. Rats ride gangways like commuters at rush hour. Fleas expand their range tenfold in an afternoon. A ship with a flourishing rat city doesn't just seed one wharf, it sprinkles fleas into the rope walk, the warehouse, the fish market, the grain quay, each a new base camp. Follow one such seed. A few infected fleas reach a granary where sacks are patched and piled. They find resident rats already living in the wall. Within days, the new bacteria are riding the old rat roots along rafters. A week later, you have a quiet die-off behind a beam, and the flea wave moves again. Port health, at this stage in history, is customs and policing, not vermin control. Officials inspect manifests and measure saltfish. They don't peel back the rope coils. So why did some outbreaks move like lightning along the coast, almost port to port? Because maritime networks are branching trees. Think of each harbor as a node, and each sailing as an edge. Ships leave Messina for Genoa, but also for Marseille, Tunis, Mallorca, Sardinia. One infested hold becomes 5 destinations, each with its own onward routes. That's why the Black Death's coastal spread looks like fireworks on a map, a burst of points radiating from one arrival, then secondaries as those points send out their own lines. It wasn't a single wave licking the shore, it was a series of spark showers, each port throwing off its own sparks inland and along the sea lanes. Now, a debate worth visiting, because good storytelling doesn't duck arguments. Was it always rat fleas? Some scholars argue human ectoparasites, body lice, head lice, or the human flea Pulex irritans could have played a larger role than classic rat to human models admit, especially in dense winter housing where people slept packed together. Lice live on us. They can move rapidly through households. Their ecology fits the indoor, cold season spikes of pneumonic clusters. A few modeling studies even reproduce certain death curves better when human ectoparasites are included. What do we do with that? We hold both ideas in view. On ships and waterfronts, the territory of ropes, grain, bilges. The rat-flea engine is brutally convincing. It explains summer peaks, warehouse corridors, and why plague entered cities along trade piers like a key in a lock. In winter, in shuttered rooms, away from docks, human ectoparasites and respiratory spread add a second act, sudden family-wide cases, household chains with almost no delay. The coastal superspreader effect doesn't require you to pick one vector forever. It asks you to notice that different ecologies hand the baton off. Rats and fleas ignite the harbor. Humans and their parasites keep embers alive in the alley networks and tenements when the weather turns. Back below decks, notice something small and lethal: time. A ship is a closed system for days or weeks. If plague enters a rat colony on day 2 of a 10-day voyage, by landfall you might have peak flea hunger just as the gangplanks drop. Crewmen are tired, barefoot, scratching. Cats have free run. A dog slips its rope and trots down the pier. Every stumble and pause is a chance for fleas to transfer. And because ports are synchronized convoys, fares, tax deadlines, you don't spread risk evenly over time. You stack it. 5 ships arrive Thursday because that's how the wind worked this week. Thursday becomes a super spreading day without any single patient zero. There are small, hacky defenses that sailors used without knowing the microbiology. Some captains kept cats, which can trim rat numbers. though cats also ferry fleas. Some ships tarred lines or hoisted rat guards metal cones on mooring ropes to slow rodent traffic. Lanterns and smoke changed flea behavior at the margins. Vinegar rinses made people feel safer. None of it is a silver bullet. But across a fleet and a season, little frictions matter. A few fewer rats boarding, a few fewer fleas making the jump, one less spark in a week of dry tinder. The inland picture ties it together. Coastal ports seeded ribs along rivers and roads, Marseille into the Rhône, Genoa into the Po Basin, Bristol up the Avon, and Severn. That branching pattern makes the epidemic look like veins under skin-thick trunks at the coast, thinner lines inland, then capillaries in market towns. Summer saw the bubonic signature along those ribs as fleas found hosts in barns and storehouses. Winter saw bursts of pneumonics spread in tight rooms. The rhythm isn't uniform, it's seasonal and infrastructural. So, when we call ports super spreaders, we're not using a buzzword, we're describing a set of physical truths. Holds grew rat cities, ropes were bridges, grain was bait, bilges kept air soft and eggs viable, scheduling stacked exposures, and every harbour stitched to 3 or 4 others by regular sailings multiplied the risk. No conspiracy, no curse, just a network doing exactly what it was built to do: move goods fast. The bacterium didn't need to outthink us, it only had to ride. Before we climb back up into the light, listen to the hold one more time. You can hear it if you kneel close, a faint scratch in the space between 2 planks, a tiny thump inside a coil, the soft patter of chaff. That sound is why Messina lit, why Marseille followed, why Genoa, Tunis, and Mallorca flickered in quick succession. Not because anyone chose catastrophe, but because below deck out of sight the conditions were perfect and the schedule was punctual. On the quay, a bell rings. The next ship eases in. New ropes hit old bollards. The bridges are down again. City as habitat. How we built for plague. Step off the gangplank and duck. Your head. Below decks, the air turns sweet and sour, grain dust, tar, old rope, a hint of fish. Your eyes adjust to a half-light where everything is texture. Stacked sacks with tiny chaff leaks, coiled hawsers as thick as a man's thigh, crates wedged into ribs, a bilge that glitters where lantern oil meets a skin of water. It feels still down here, but it isn't. The hold is a living city. Watch the ropes first. Hemp is a ladder. Black rats ratus are built for this gym. Light bodies, long tails for balance, paws that grip fibers like rungs. They cross from quay to deck at dusk, work the rigging, and vanish into the lattice of beams above you. They love edges, where a sack meets a plank, where a beam meets a bulkhead, where a coil of rope leaves a dark pocket. If you were a rat, you'd map the hold as a chain of safe triangles. If you were a flea, you'd map the rats. Now kneel by the grain. Sacks aren't sealed worlds. They leak and sweat. A trickle of wheat becomes a buffet. Rats set up middens under the stacks, gnaw small arcs in the canvas, drag kernels behind a board and eat there, leaving a track of droppings and flea eggs. A single pregnant rat can turn a corner of the hold into a colony within weeks. Add 2 more rats, and you have neighborhoods. The bilge makes it better. Just enough damp to keep air soft, never enough to flood a nest if the ship is tight. Every creak of hull is a lullaby. And on those rats live the tiny villains with perfect timing, Xenopsilla chopis, the oriental rat flea. Most days, a flea is a simple machine: leap, bite, drink, lay eggs. But plague turns it into something else. When Yersinia pestis colonizes a flea's foregut, it builds a blockage like jam packed into the insect's feeding tube. The flea tries to feed and can't. The blood won't pass. It starves while standing on a banquet. Starving makes it frantic. It bites again and again, sawing with its mouthparts, and in the effort, it coughs back. What's jammed up inside? A slurry of bacteria, right into the bite wound. That's the blocked foregut mechanism, biology's cruel feedback loop. The hungrier the flea gets, the more effective a spreader it becomes. Put this loop on a ship, and you get a microeconomy of disease. Rats flourish, fleas flourish, and when rats die in clusters, as they often do when plague rips through a colony, their fleas go hunting. A rope touching a mooring post is a bridge. A coil that warms under a lantern becomes a nursery. A sail stowed in a forecastle is a flea apartment block with long corridors of canvas. And if the rat population crashes suddenly, hungry fleas aren't picky. They'll test a dog, a cat, even a human ankle when the watch is changed at midnight. Below decks is not dirty by moral failing, it's perfect habitat by design. Up top, the port breathes on a schedule. Tides, winds, convoy windows, market days. That rhythm is why harbors became super spreaders. Ships don't dribble in randomly, they stack. A north wind stalls 3 galleys outside the breakwater, then shifts and brings 10 in at once. The quay bursts porters, scales, tally sticks, crates slamming down, rigging, singing, animals bellowing. Rats ride gangways like commuters at rush hour. Fleas expand their range tenfold in an afternoon. A ship with a flourishing rat city doesn't just seed one wharf, it sprinkles fleas into the rope walk, the warehouse, the fish market, the grain quay, each a new base camp. Follow one such seed. A few infected fleas reach a granary where sacks are patched and piled. They find resident rats already living in the wall. Within days, the new bacteria are riding the old rat roots along rafters. A week later, you have a quiet die-off behind a beam, and the flea wave moves again. Port health, at this stage in history, is customs and policing, not vermin control. Officials inspect manifests and measure salt fish. They don't peel back the rope coils. So, why did some outbreaks move like lightning along the coast, almost port to port? Because maritime networks are branching trees. Think of each harbor as a node and each sailing as an edge. Ships leave Messina for Genoa, but also for Marseille, Tunis, Majorca, Sardinia. One infested hold becomes 5 destinations, each with its own onward routes. That's why the Black Death's coastal spread looks like fireworks on a map. A burst of points radiating from one arrival, then secondaries, as those points send out their own lines. It wasn't a single wave licking the shore. It was a series of spark showers, each port throwing off its own sparks inland and along the sea lanes. Now, a debate worth visiting because good storytelling doesn't duck arguments. Was it always rat fleas? Some scholars argue human ectoparasites, body lice, head lice, or the human flea pulex irritans could have played a larger role than classic rat to human models admit, especially in dense winter housing, where people slept packed together. Lice live on us. They can move rapidly through households. Their ecology fits the indoor, cold season spikes of pneumonic clusters. A few modeling studies even reproduce certain death curves better when human ectoparasites are included. What do we do with that? We hold both ideas in view. On ships and waterfronts, the territory of ropes, grain, bilges, the rat flea engine is brutally convincing. It explains summer peaks, warehouse corridors, and why plague entered cities along trade piers like a key in a lock. In winter, in shuttered rooms away from docks, human ectoparasites and respiratory spread add a second act. Sudden family-wide cases, household chains with almost no delay. The coastal super spreader effect doesn't require you to pick one vector forever. It asks you to notice that different ecologies hand the baton off. Rats and fleas ignite the harbor. Humans and their parasites keep embers alive in the alley networks and tenements when the weather turns. Back below decks, notice something small and lethal. Time. A ship is a closed system for days or weeks. If plague enters a rat colony on day 2 of a 10-day voyage, by landfall you might have peak flea hunger just as the gangplanks drop. Crewmen are tired, barefoot, scratching. Cats have free run. A dog slips its rope and trots down the pier. Every stumble and pause is a chance for fleas to transfer. And because ports are synchronized convoys, fares, tax deadlines, you don't spread risk evenly over time. You stack it. 5 ships arrive Thursday because that's how the wind worked this week. Thursday becomes a super-spreading day without any single patient zero. There are small, hacky defenses that sailors used without knowing the microbiology. Some captains kept cats, which can trim rat numbers, though cats also ferry fleas. Some ships tarred lines or hoisted rat guards metal cones on mooring ropes to slow rodent traffic. Lanterns and smoke changed flea behavior at the margins. Vinegar rinses made people feel safer. None of it is a silver bullet. But across a fleet and a season, little frictions matter. A few fewer rats boarding, a few fewer fleas making the jump, one less spark in a week of dry tinder. The inland picture ties it together. Coastal ports seeded, ribs along rivers and roads, Marseille into the Rhône, Genoa into the Po Basin, Bristol up the Avon, and Severn. That branching pattern makes the epidemic look like veins under skin, thick trunks at the coast, thinner lines inland, then capillaries in market towns. Summer saw the bubonic signature along those ribs as fleas found hosts in barns and storehouses. Winter saw bursts of pneumonic spread in tight rooms. The rhythm isn't uniform, it's seasonal and infrastructural. So when we call ports super spreaders, we're not using a buzzword, we're describing a set of physical truths. Holds grew rat cities, ropes were bridges, grain was bait, bilges kept air soft and eggs viable. Scheduling stacked exposures, and every harbour stitched to 3 or 4 others by regular sailings multiplied the risk. No conspiracy, no curse, just a network doing exactly what it was built to do. Move goods fast. The bacterium didn't need to outthink us, it only had to ride. Before we climb back up into the light, listen to the hold one more time. You can hear it if you kneel close, a faint scratch in the space between 2 planks, a tiny thump inside a coil, the soft patter of chaff. That sound is why Messina lit, why Marseille followed, why Genoa, Tunis, and Mallorca flickered in quick succession. Not because anyone chose catastrophe, but because below deck out of sight, the conditions were perfect and the schedule was punctual. On the quay, a bell rings. The next ship eases in. New ropes hit old bollards. The bridges are down again. The body in 3 acts, bubonic, pneumonic, septicemic. Close your eyes and meet one ordinary person. In an ordinary winter, a trader named Matteo comes home from the waterfront at dusk. He thinks the itch on his ankle is from a splintered plank. It isn't. A hungry flea has just solved its problem and given him one. Acti bubonic, the bite that starts a clock. For a couple of days, usually 2 to 6, nothing much happens. Matteo feels fine. He unloads sacks, laughs with neighbors, sleeps under a wool blanket. Inside him, though, the bacteria that flea coughed into the bite are riding tiny highways under the skin and turning toward the body's filters, the lymph nodes. The groin and the armpit are common way stations because most bites happen on legs and hands. The lymph nodes are like security posts. In plague, the invaders use them as base camps. On day 3, Matteo feels off. A fever starts fast. His head pounds. By afternoon, he can point with one finger to the pain, a knot deep in the groin that feels like a bruise from the inside. The knot swells into a bubo, a tense, hot bulge that throbs when he moves. His skin turns tight and shiny over it. He shivers, then sweats, then shivers again. He can't keep food down. Family members tell him to drink broth. He nods and sleeps. This is bubonic plague, the most common form. Without modern medicine, the chance of dying is high. Think about half, often 50–60%, but not certain. Some people survive. In a few days, the bubo may soften and suppurate. That's a polite word for turn to nasty fluid and burst. It's horrible, But for some, it's the turning point toward life. Others decline even as the swelling changes. No two bodies read the play the same way. The painful bubo isn't random. Its location maps the bite. An ankle bite? Groin bubo? A hand bite? Armpit bubo. The body is literally showing you the route the bacteria took. People who lived sometimes kept a crooked neck or arm for life because healed nodes scarred tight and pulled tendons. Families often learned to read the fever day. If the worst peak broke by the third or fourth day of symptoms, hope rose. When bubonic plague stays in this lane, lymph nodes, fever, weakness, family members caring for Matteo aren't at high risk just from being in the room. The danger rises if his case changes lanes. Act 2. Pneumonic winter breath, short distances. Now, shift the season. It's winter, shutters are closed, the fire is small, and everyone sleeps in the same room for warmth. In this world, a different path opens. Pneumonic plague in the lungs. It can follow bubonic disease, the infection spills inward, or start in the lungs first if someone breathes in droplets from a sick person. Unlike flea bite plague, this one jumps by breath at arm's length. The timeline is ruthless. After a short incubation, often 1 to 4 days, the cough comes like a sudden storm. It's dry for hours, then pink, then red. The chest feels tight and the breath quickens, not just from fever, but because the lungs are filling with inflammation. Neighbors describe a sweet, metallic smell, the kind you don't forget. The voice goes ragged, words shrink to 1 or 2 at a time, and a red foam stains the lips. Time to death can be 24-72 hours from the first coughing fit without modern care. Why do we keep finding winter clusters in old records? Not because cold air creates plague, but because winter packs bodies together and traps breath. Doors stay closed, windows are parchment and draft blockers. Close contact is constant prayers at the bed, shared bowls, whispered goodbyes. In that setting, human-to-human transmission finally outruns rats and fleas. You see a pattern. A healthy caregiver on Monday, coughing by Thursday, gone by Saturday. That's why chroniclers wrote about whole households failing in a week. It's not magic, it's proximity. Quiet facts that matter. Pneumonic plague can begin without any buboes. That confused people then and still tricks readers now. No, swelling doesn't mean not plague. People noticed a short fuse chain. 1 death today, 2 next door 2 days later, more across the street by the end of the week. That tempo is a fingerprint of breath-borne spread in winter rooms. A small number survived even pneumonic illness, but it was rare without help. To families, recovery felt like a miracle. Act 3. Septicemic. When the blood itself turns hostile, there's a third path, the quickest and cruelest. Septicemic plague. Sometimes it follows the bubonic route. Sometimes it starts there, especially after a heavy bacterial dose from multiple bites. Here, the bacteria flood the bloodstream so fast the body can't set up a defense. The first sign may be a sudden collapse, delirium, then a startling chill that shakes the bed. Look at the skin. Tiny purple spots bloom purpura as small vessels start to leak. Fingers and toes can turn dusky. In later stages, they may go black from lack of blood, which is one reason the era earned its dark nickname. The gut cramps, the mind wanders, and the clock moves terribly fast, sometimes just hours from first bad signs to the end. Family stories say it bluntly. He felt cold in the morning and was not with us by night. Truths people knew without names. Septicemic plague often skips the bubo. That confused even sharp observers. No swelling, yet he died faster. The creamy, oily sweat some described belongs to a body in shock, trying and failing to keep temperature steady. A person might look less frightening in the first hour than someone with huge buboes, then die sooner the disease's cruel misdirection. Following the paths in one house, put these acts together in one home and you see the Black Death's cruel choreography. Day 0. Matteo gets a flea bite on the docks. He doesn't know. Days 2-4. Fever and a groin bubonic plague. Family keeps close, shares soup, says prayers. Days 3-5. Matteo's 5. Cousin sleeps by the hearth through 2 cold nights. He doesn't get bitten, but the room is tight and damp from breath. He inhales the wrong cough at the wrong time. Pneumonic plague begins. His cough turns red within 2 days. Same week, Matteo's wife, who tended his bubo and laundered linen soaked with pus, spikes a fever too. Her form could go bubonic, but the dose and route are messy. By evening, she's shivering hard with dark speckles on her skin, septicemic plague. From the outside, the neighborhood sees a wave. From the inside, it's 3 rides on one machine, each using a different entrance. What the numbers really mean. People ask for one number. How deadly was it? Real life refuses one number. Think in bands. Bubonic, untreated, about 50–60% fatal, with big swings by place and season. Pneumonic, untreated, very high, often 90% plus, because breath pulls the battle into the lungs. Septicemic, untreated, nearly always fatal and fast. Those aren't lottery tickets, they're warnings. They also explain why some towns saw neighbors return from the edge and others saw entire streets go quiet between market days. Why some lived. Even then, survivors existed. A few reasons tucked between lines. Dose matters. One flea's small inoculum might give a body time to counter. Several bites or a blood-borne spill overwhelm the startup defenses. Route matters. A skin and node battle bubonic gives days. A lung war, pneumonic, gives hours to a couple of days. Care matters. Cool cloths, fluids, opening a bubo, dangerous but occasionally relieving pressure, and simple nursing, sometimes bought time for the immune system. Families noticed patterns and improvised. They aired bedding in sun and smoke. They kept catarrh, thick congestion, away from the sick by propping them up. They tried to separate sleepers in winter, not always possible, sometimes life-saving. They didn't have the words vector control or respiratory isolation, but piece by piece they stumbled toward the practices that later became rules. The winter clue that solved a mystery. Later readers of the chronicles saw an odd note in many towns. Summer deaths with big buboes near the docks. Winter chains of coughing deaths in single households. That seasonal flip is a compass. Summer says fleas and rats set the first fires. Winter says people spread it to people at close range. Once you see that, you understand why shutting a gate sometimes helped and sometimes didn't. Why burning a ship didn't stop indoor clusters, and why the same city could suffer 2 different tempo patterns a few months apart. Curtain call. 3 acts, 1 disease. Bubonic, the body's filters under siege. Days to declare itself. Some can live. Pneumonic, winter breath carrying death from mouth to mouth. Hours to days, rarely forgiving. Septicemic, the bloodstream lost in a red storm. Hours, the quickest curtain. Call it clinical if you like. But for people then, it was simple. The lump that wouldn't stop growing. The cough that tasted like copper. The cold that crept from fingertips inward. The science explains the sequence. The season and the room explain the spread. And in those explanations sits the first real power people ever had against it. Noticing not just what killed, but how and when it moved. Beliefs versus bodies, from humors to quarantine. Imagine 2 rooms on the same afternoon in 1348. In Paris, a high-ceilinged hall smells of ink and beeswax. Masters of the medical faculty, robes, rings, reputation argue over the sky. They have charts of the heavens and the confidence of Aristotle on their side. A rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in Aquarius, they say, has thickened the air with dangerous vapors. The remedy? Balance the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow and black bile by bleeding, purging and scenting the air with costly aromatics. Keep your windows shut on bad winds. Carry posies. Avoid baths that open the pores. If illness swells a node, lance it and apply a poultice. If the body feels too hot, let blood until it cools. It's coherent, elegant, and fatally theoretical. Now cross the Alps to Venice and duck into a different room, a cramped magistracy office that smells of tar and brine. Clerks, boatmen, and a grim-faced official crowd around a rough table. A convoy from the east sits just beyond the lagoon, crews feverish by the report. The question on the table isn't which star caused it, it's what to do with the ships. This is beliefs versus bodies in one split screen. In the lecture hall, illness is math in the ether. On the waterfront, it's movement of men, goods, rats, fleas, and breath. The humoral model wasn't foolish, it was the best toolkit most physicians had. People did feel too hot or too cold, and bleeding sometimes helped other conditions. The miasma idea, bad air fit scenes that stank and killed. The astrology council in Paris even tried to be practical. Avoid night air, burn juniper, don't overeat, keep cheer. But none of it touched the vectors sneaking through rope coils and granaries. Meanwhile, cities were learning by watching where bodies fell. Venice, especially, started acting like a public health lab long before there was a textbook. The city lived or died by its harbor that sharpened the mind. First came improvisations with a sheriff's bluntness. Crews that looked ill, hold them off the quays. Cargo that stank and stained, burn it. A galley with corpses below? In some cases, torch the hull on a sandbar and salvage only what could be boiled or smoked. None of this was born from theory. It came from patterns: ships, sick neighborhoods, rope walks, rat bursts, crowd funerals, new fevers. You don't need a star chart to see a dock worker coughing blood after unloading grain. Then the practice got systematic. Venice began to stage arrivals anchorage outside the lagoon, inspection, detention, and to separate people and goods by time. The idea was simple. If the illness shows itself within a set number of days, you keep it outside. That number wandered at first 20, 30, whatever a frightened council could enforce. In Ragusa, Dubrovnik, in 1377, the city codified a 30-day wait for people coming from infected places on nearby islets rather than inside the walls. That was policy by iteration, not revelation, a rule made after watching what happened when they didn't wait. Venice pushed the same logic further in the 1400s, hardening custom into infrastructure. The city set aside islands, lazaretti, to warehouse risk. First people, the Lazaretto Vecchio, then later suspect goods, the Lazaretto Nuovo, passed through a timed isolation that, in Venice's hands, often stretched to 40 giorni, 40 days. The word quarantine comes from that 40, but the crucial innovation wasn't the number, it was the clock. Venice built a machine that turned time into a barrier. Between these anchorages and islands, smaller habits tightened into law. Health guards patrolled canals. Corpse boats, gondolas with crews on fixed routes, collected the dead to prevent backyard burials that fouled wells and carried fleas. City statutes designated burial grounds away from wells and markets and laid out grave trench dimensions to speed interments. Rag and rope shops were ordered to air and smoke goods. Tanners and tripe sellers took turns closing to keep refuse from piling. None of this cured plague, a lot of it slowed it. That difference between cure and control is the hinge of public health. Notice the clash in tone. In Paris, the most learned men in Europe carefully debated which planet cooked the air. In Venice, harbour masters asked, which boat, which pier, which alley? In one room, the dose was cosmic. In the other, it was contact. And as months passed, the ledger that mattered most was not the chart of Mars, but the tally of houses spared when a boat waited 8 days instead of docking at once. Were there missteps on the practice side? plenty. Burning ships is a brutal tool that can punish the innocent and wreck livelihoods. Locking people on an island without adequate food or shelter can turn policy into cruelty. Late medieval sanitation mixed common sense, move offal away from water, with superstition, perfume the air, and with scapegoating blame the nearest outsider. Venice learned by paper cuts, orders amended and re-amended, as the city saw what helped and what backfired. And yet, by the late 14th and early 15th century, you can watch a logic crystallize. Separate by time. Let the illness declare itself outside the walls. Separate by place. Sick here, well there. Suspect cargo in a dedicated depot. Separate by route. Guard gates, stage arrivals, stagger market days. Document. Who came from where, on what day, on which boat. That last point paper may be the least glamorous and most powerful. Early bills of health and port records turned rumor into something a magistrate could act on. If a ship from an ill place arrives, treat it one way. If it carries a certificate from a clean port, treat it another. The documents were imperfect, gameable, and sometimes outright lies. They were also the seed of an information layer on top of trade, a way to steer risk with ink. Back in the belief room, doctors still prescribed theriac, a luxury syrup, counseled moderation, and timed bleedings by the moon. Some city councils ordered perfumed fires on street corners, or bell ringing to cleanse the air, rituals that soothed fear more than they shifted curves. But notice what stuck. Not the planet charts, not the commanders, but the protocols. Hold the ship, use the island, collect the bodies, control the dump, write it down. There's a kindness in that shift. You can't argue with Mars. You can move a boat. You can change a gate schedule, widen a grave trench, assign 2 extra men to the corpse cart on Fridays because the market draws crowds on Thursdays. You can decide that rope bales will air 3 days on the quay before entering the rope walk. You can watch and tune. And that, really, is the heart of beliefs versus bodies. The humoral and miasma frameworks gave people stories about why they were suffering. The waterfront gave them levers to suffer less. Ragusa's 30-day rule wasn't born perfect. It was a first draft that taught Venice what 40 could do. Venice's lazarettes weren't kind at first. They became more humane as officials grasped that compliance rises when conditions are tolerable. Theory held the lantern, iteration found the path. If you want a single image to carry forward, keep this one: a pilot boat pulling alongside a tired galley at dusk. An officer leans up, asks 3 questions from where, with whom, and when, then raises a lantern twice. The galley peels off, toward the island of waiting, not the city of bells. In Paris, Mars still glows in Aquarius. In Venice, the useful star has become a clock. Faith, fear, and the human cost picture a city square at dusk. Bells carry over rooftops. A procession gathers banners, candles, a wooden cross lifted high. People kneel, whispering the oldest prayers they know. They are not naive. They've buried neighbors this week. They're here because fear needs form, and ritual is a container. Now follow the same square at midnight. The candles are gone, drums and voices rise. 50, 100 men and women move through like a storm front flagellants on a penitential circuit. Bare backs striped with self-inflicted lashes, they chant, beg forgiveness, promise that if sin brought the scourge, pain will push it back. They mean it. And yet, everywhere these circuits go, the pattern follows. 3 days later, the first coughs. A week later, funerals. Not because God is cruel, and not because penance attracts plague, but because constant, tight-packed movement, shared meals, shared bedding, shared air trail seeds disease along their route. Good intentions turning into bad epidemiology in real time. Faith and fear lived side by side, and both left tracks. You can't tell this story without the pogroms. When terror outpaced understanding, some towns grabbed the nearest explanation with a face. Jews poisoned the wells. It was a lie that traveled fast. In city after city, authorities squeezed confessions under torture and then set fires that lit the winter sky. Strasbourg burned hundreds. Smaller places copied the script. Public killings pitched as prevention. It shames the memory of anyone who reads those ledgers. But the record is not one color. Pope Clement VI, sitting with his court in Avignon, issued bulls that said bluntly, "It is not true that Jews caused the plague, they're dying too." He threatened excommunication for those who attacked them. Casimir III in Poland offered refuge, issuing protections that let Jewish communities move and rebuild. Some city councils, Marseille was one, put their guard on the side of the threatened, not the mob. The same century that saw hatred weaponized also saw leaders plant legal stakes for decency. Avignon, meanwhile, was not a safe balcony seat. The papal city filled with refugees until it could not breathe. Clerical mortality was brutal. Monks and friars did what they were trained to do. They went room to room, heard confessions, anointed the dying. Many died themselves. Clement VI did something both symbolic and practical. He consecrated the Rhone, so bodies could be dropped into the river when graveyards overflowed and still be considered buried in hallowed ground. He held court between two great fires, believing, wrongly, that flames purified the air, and rightly, by accident, that heat and smoke made fleas less lively. He bought grain to blunt famine's edge when trade faltered. It didn't save everyone, it saved some. So why did institutions lose credibility? Start with the mismatch between promises and results. Learned men in Paris wrote a well-reasoned memorandum about a planetary conjunction and foul vapors. Towns that followed those prescriptions still lost half their neighbors. Priests preached fasts and processions. The numbers kept climbing. Physicians bled aristocrats and lanced buboes. The best they could often achieve was easing pain, not turning the tide. When you bury a child 2 days after the sermon that told you to sweeten the air with roses, your trust does not come back quickly. Add the human failures that plague pressure exposes. Some officials fled early and lied about it. Some guilds hoarded stock. Some clergy sold indulgences like umbrellas in a storm. People notice. A century later, reform movements will bite into these memories like citrus into fat. This is where the bitterness started. And yet, hold two truths at once: some leaders mitigated harm, sometimes brilliantly. Venetian magistrates learned to stage ships outside the lagoon and set up isolation islands. They standardized corpse collection so alley burials didn't feed rat populations. They wrote burial ordinances that moved trenches away from wells. In Mamluk Cairo, judges issued rulings that altered communal prayers and processions during peak sickness. Mutasibs, market inspectors, tried to keep bread prices from stampeding into riot. In parishes from Kent to Catalonia, unknown priests did quiet, heroic work, organizing the sick into separate rooms, opening granaries during price spikes, writing down names so families would remember those they could not bury properly. These are small acts on paper. Inside a street, they are the difference between collapse and endurance. The flagellant story comes full circle here. Many cities welcomed them at first, who wouldn't, when the official answers felt stale and the sight of contrition looked like action. But as the trail seeding became hard to ignore, as their marches amplified panic and sometimes incited violence against minorities, popes and princes turned. Clement VI condemned the movement. Local authorities banned entries, closed gates, broke up gatherings. Not because they had the modern words super spreader, but because they had eyes. They were learning, painfully, to govern behavior when they could not govern bacteria. The human cost ran deeper than head counts. Art bent under it. Skeletons dancing with bishops and bakers in the Danse Macabre, a shared stage where status evaporated under the same grin. Literature changed voice. Boccaccio's tales begin with Flight from Florence, not A Courtly Garden. Music darkened in places, brightened in others. Some chant traditions turned austere, while folk songs tried to laugh at the dark. Law grew teeth, emergency ordinances about funerals, markets, city gates. Some of those teeth bit unjustly, some bit exactly where they should. Faith itself did not break, it rearranged. In Christian Europe, many saw plague as punishment, yes, but also as test and mystery. In the Islamic world, scholars argued whether plague was martyrdom for the faithful and cautioned against fleeing or entering a plague-struck land, a moral frame that, though not designed for microbes, incidentally aligned with containment. Everywhere, ordinary people layered practical habits over prayers: fewer wakes, shorter vigils, doors propped open during visits, bread left at thresholds instead of shared at tables. It's easy, centuries later, to grade everyone with perfect hindsight. Better to read the record with humility. Faced with something they could not see, societies threw every tool they had: theology, theory, theatre, and trial and error policy. They scapegoated and they sheltered. They failed loudly in some places and succeeded quietly in others. They burned ships and boiled linens. They rang bells and wrote ordinances. And under all of it, people did what people always do. They tried to make meaning out of chaos and make room for each other inside it. If you need a single mirror moment, stand again in that square. In one direction, the procession prayer as balm. In the other, the flagellant circuit pain as plea. At the edge, a city officer with a short list: close the east gate at noon, move the corpse cart to the harbour. Tell the baker he can raise prices a little, but not a lot. Faith held hands with fear, policy learned to hold a line. Institutions lost credibility where they promised the impossible. Some earned it back slowly where they delivered the possible: less hunger, fewer crowds, cleaner wells, longer waits for risky ships. The plague measured societies the way a flood measures a riverbank. It showed where the sand was and where the stone was. And even in the scoured places, people stacked new stones. The archipelago of outbreaks, case files across Europe. Venice, governance by the tide, public health governance, signature insight. Venice turned the sea into a clock. Faced with repeat coastal seeding, magistrates didn't ask why the stars. They asked, how long outside? That question built the lacerette system: staged anchorages, inspection, then isolation islands that separated people and cargo by time. Maritime statutes hardened practice into law: health guards on canals, fixed corpse boat routes, burial grounds sited away from wells, and early bills of health for ships. Result: not a cure, but a governable delay that blunted each maritime spark before it reached the Rialto. Fields, #6/34, Florence. When culture became a record, cultural memory, signature insight, the city's collapse survives in its literature as well as its ledgers. Boccaccio's opening to the Decameron doubles as a damage report: purple swellings, emptied streets, trench burials layered like cargo, and social contracts, snapping parents abandoning children, guild routines dissolving. That eyewitness tone fixed the urban breakdown in Europe's cultural memory, turning one city's spring of 1348 into a template for how people remember catastrophe. Fields, #26/28/34. Paris density versus decrees, law and governance. Signature insight: Paris shows how administration meets geometry. The Crown and the University issued ordinances: market spacing, refuse controls, processions limited. Yet the city's density, narrow streets, shared courtyards, multifamily rooms, kept refueling transmission. Paris proves that law without spatial leverage underperforms. You can announce miasma cures from the Châtelet, but if you can't thin households or stage traffic at bridges and gates, paper loses to proximity. Fields, #0/28/34, London, a pit that spoke DNA forensics, signature insight. The East Smithfield Plague Pit, became a laboratory 7 centuries late. Ancient DNA recovered from intact molars, traced Yersinia pestis lineages, and helped pin the Black Death's European explosion to a specific branch on the pathogen's family tree. For London, the mass grave is more than grief. It's proof the city's dead, telling us which strain arrived, how it diversified, and how that phylogeny links back toward Central Asia. Policy failed then. Forensics repaid a debt later by rewriting origins. Fields, #2four, #34, Bristol and the Channel ports. Twin beachheads, mobility networks, signature insight. England's catastrophe began as 2 coastal landings, Channel towns Weymouth, Melcombe Regis, Southampton Portsmouth, and Bristol, that sent infection inland along river ribs, Avon, Severn, Thames. The pattern looks like a vascular map. Thick coastal trunks, then branching market roads and ferries. It's the cleanest demonstration that port-to-port seeding plus river logistics beats any single patient zero. Mobility rhythms, the fare calendar, wool convoys, tidal windows explain the speed better than rumor does. Fields, #6, #10, #34. Iberia War as an accelerator, war multiplier. Signature insight. The siege of Gibraltar and the death of Alfonso XI of Castile reveal plague's favorite ally, campaign logistics. Sieges compress bodies, foul water, concentrate animals, and force night bivouacs, perfect for rat colonies and indoor winter spread. Armies marched disease between fortified nodes, then dispersed it to recruiting towns. In Iberia, the front lines didn't just suffer, they redistributed risk to rear areas when garrisons rotated or broke. War didn't cause plague, it sped it and widened the blast radius. Fields, #9, #10, #34. Why these 6 files matter together, strung across a map, they read like separate tragedies. Read as a system, they form an archipelago of outbreaks linked by ships, statutes, stories, and soldiers. Venice shows how governance can slow sparks. Florence, how memory preserves lessons. Paris, how density blunts decrees. London, how forensics clarifies origins. The Channel, how networks shape wavefronts. Iberia, how war multiplies every hazard. Stitch them, and you get the Black Death's real shape. Not one wave, but many lit by ports, pushed by roads and rivers, amplified by winter rooms and summer fleas, and remembered in laws, graves, and books. After the storm, how a smaller Europe found new paths. Night settles over the fields and towns, and the world is a little quieter than it used to be. Imagine walking a lane after harvest, the hedges brushed with cold, the stars unhurried over rooflines. In the distance, a mill turns without hurry. Closer by, a cottage window glows, and voices carry softly through the thatch. This is Europe after the Great Mortality, not a different map, but a different weight. Fewer footsteps on the road, more space between doors, and in that wide hush, new possibilities begin to breathe. No one counted perfectly, but most who study these years agree on a careful range. In much of Europe, something like 3 to 6 people out of 10 were gone, with the pain unevenly scattered, some villages almost untouched, others hollowed out in a season. Beyond Europe, the sums are hazier, the ledgers thinner. The famous 200 million you sometimes hear is more thunder than truth. The real global total is uncertain, and prudence says it was almost certainly lower than that, given how many people lived on Earth around 1,350. What matters most in this story isn't the exact number, it's what the emptiness did. Start in the fields. When hands are scarce, work grows precious. The same acres require fewer men, and women can name a price for their time. Wages tick upward, slowly at first, then with the stubbornness of a new habit. Landlords notice. Some try to nail yesterday in place with law's orders to keep pay as it was, to hold laborers to their old duties, to forbid a young man from walking down the road to a better bargain. On parchment, these statutes look stern and permanent. In the lanes, they look like wishes. People walk anyway. They test distances, discover which reeves are blusterers and which will actually chase them, and learn something important. Choice is possible. Serfdom, those old bindings of rent and service, doesn't shatter with a single crack. It loosens, it creaks, it negotiates. A steward agrees to cash in place of labor days. A tenant gains lighter dues in return for repairing a collapsed hedge. A widow takes a small plot outright because there is no one else to keep it breathing. In some places, the old forms return with the next generation, thicker than ever. In others, they never quite recover their old tightness. Change does not march. It settles, like silt in a river after flood. Watch the workshops, too. When there aren't enough apprentices to sweep the floor, the master tinkers with the loom. When there aren't enough boys to turn the crank, a wheel is rigged to the stream. Mills grow, clever with gearing. Fulling hammers thud where hands once toiled. Wind and water take a little more of the burden onto their shoulders. No one calls it an age of invention, there's too much mourning for that, but bit by bit, tools grow to fill the spaces the dead have left. Not a straight road to factories and smoke, only a season where levers, teeth, and pulleys quietly multiply. Inside homes, roles shift because they must. A woman who once managed kitchen and market begins tallying accounts for an estate because the reeve is gone. A daughter who learned to spin also learns to bargain for fleece. The records remember this not as applause but as friction fines against improper work. Guild mutters about who may stand at which bench, notes in manor books about women contracted to mow, to glean, to keep the keys. The river runs forward and back. As population slowly rises, some doors close again, and yet a memory remains, the knowing that those doors opened for a time and the house did not fall. Law leaves its own trail of footprints. Emergency rules, born in sirens and smoke, harden into statutes. How far a market stall must sit from a well, how soon the dead must be carried from a house, which streets may host tanners or tripe sellers, and which must keep their air clean for bread. By the sea, harbour towns learn a choreography of caution and ink, ships held in the roadstead, goods aired before they are unlashed, bills of health tucked under wax, so that risk can be steered with a signature instead of a rumour. These are not cures, they're habits, and habits are what keep a city steady when the future wobbles. Through all of it, people reach for meaning, because the heart does not run on ordinances. Art answers first. On the walls of churches and ossuaries, skeletons link hands with the living and dance a solemn circle. Pope, prince, merchant, miller, each drawn into the same step. The dance macabre doesn't jeer, it levels. It says, "Look, the gate opens to everyone." Knowing this, how will you walk? In the years ahead, choruses take up the same tune, stories do too. A young Florentine's tales set outside a plague-struck city become a way to talk about love and luck, while acknowledging the ashes on the wind. These pictures and pages are more than entertainment. They're social therapy, a way to make grief bearable by giving it form and frame. In council chambers, something else settles, a new sense of what power is allowed to do. Yesterday's rulers were caretakers of peace, of weights and measures, of borders and harvest dues. Tomorrow's rulers will also be custodians of risk. They will close gates, regulate funerals, time the opening of markets, set men to collect the dead along fixed routes, and require that cargo rest beneath sun and smoke before it meets a buyer. It doesn't always work. It isn't always kind. But a belief takes root that the city, the realm, has the right and duty to shape the odds when sickness comes. Nothing about this world is neat. Wages rise, then dip, then rise again. Some lords sink under debt and sell, others adapt and thrive. Towns that learn to keep ships waiting also learn to let them in too soon when trade pinches. Even the best laws are unevenly enforced. Even the best intentions go crooked in the hands of the frightened. And yet, if you stand far back and let the centuries blur a little, a pattern shows through like the lines of an old woodcut. Scarcity loosens bonds, choice widens, tools step forward. Law grows administrative muscles, and art keeps the soul from hardening. There are debates at every turn, and they are worth hearing, even softly, as you drift. Did higher wages last long enough to truly transform ordinary lives, or did they fade as families filled homes again? In one place, a century of comfort. In another, a single generation of relief before prices catch up. Did the fall of serfdom begin here, or only change its clothes? In one county, the manor rolls still hum with obedience. In another, the ink curves into contracts that sound startlingly modern. Was the nudge toward water wheels and better looms a path to later machines, or just a clever pause in the middle of sorrow? Wise heads still argue, and the truth is a field of overlapping circles, not a single bright dot. But some ground is firm. The best scholarship speaks of European mortality in ranges, not proclamations 30 to 60% across regions, rather than a tidy single figure. It warns gently against swollen global counts, remembers how uneven the record is outside the busiest ports and richest bishoprics, and keeps humility close. In that humility, there's respect for the dead, and for the simple fact that the living did their best with information that came too late, and tools that were still being invented. And there is one more piece, small and human, that lives in parish lists more than in grand chronicles. After the worst years, people married. Babies were born. Young couples took cottages that had stood dark and refilled them with the ordinary noises of washing, scolding, singing. Town councils opened granaries in lean months when prices ran too hot. Neighbors left cords of wood by doors where coughs were heard. A few bequests bought bells so funerals could be marked with dignity even when the ground was hard and the world was tired. Not progress as a trumpet fanfare, progress as simple decency, multiplied. If you need a way to hold all of this as you close your eyes, think of Europe as a great loom after a storm. Many threads have snapped. The cloth is thinner. The pattern looks broken in places. The weavers do not start a new tapestry. They pick up what remains and rethread. Tighter in some bands, looser in others. New colors where old dyes ran out. Patches where tears went too wide to mend. The cloth is never what it was. In some ways it is poorer, in others surprisingly stronger. So we end our watch in that quiet lane. The mill still turns, the window still glows. In a room with fewer chairs than before, a family finishes bread and says little prayers out of habit rather than fear. Tomorrow there will be wages to discuss, and perhaps a steward to meet, and maybe a new wheel to fit on the press. The church mural will still show the bony hand, and the bell will still speak for the dead, but the living will make their lists and sweep their thresholds and carry their baskets to market with a steadier step. After the storm, Europe is smaller, and because it is smaller, the space between people is wider space for bargains, for tools, for laws, for songs, for mercy. In that space, possibilities sit quietly, like seeds in winter ground. They do not rush. They wait for weather, for patience, for a hand to remember where to plant. And while they wait, the night deepens, the road empties, and the world scarred, altered, persistent settles into sleep. The provocation, we didn't just survive, we invented survival. Let's dim the lantern one last time and look back across the map we've been walking. In the beginning, it seemed like fate was a storm, random, merciless, senseless. But follow the thread carefully, and you see something else glinting in the weave. When the Black Death pressed Europe to the wall, people didn't only endure, they made things habits, tools, rules that taught their descendants how to meet the next blow without breaking. Think of the sea first. Quarantine didn't fall from the sky as a theory. It was hammered out on wet decks and in cramped council rooms by men who had to decide before sunset whether a ship could tie up or must wait offshore. The result was a new instrument with a quiet, radical idea: time itself as a barrier. 40 days on an island of waiting, lazarettes for people and goods, bills of health tucked under seals paper, and patience turning panic into policy. Those choices echo whenever a port staggers arrivals, screens crews, or keeps certain cargo in the sun a little longer. On land, burial became logistics. Not a single mass of grief, but a moving system, fixed, bring out your dead roots, trench dimensions written into statutes, new cemeteries sited where they wouldn't poison wells. It sounds grim because it is, and yet that machinery softened catastrophe. It kept neighborhoods from becoming open charnel grounds. It taught cities how to keep the living safer by treating the dead with a rough, urgent order. Then the ledgers. For all the candles and prayers, the tool that might have changed the most was ink. Names entered, ships logged, markets timetabled, prices watched, wages capped and argued, gates opened and closed by ordinance, not rumor. The habit of record-keeping who, when, where, grew ribs around flimsy memory. Centuries later, those same ledgers let modern scholars trace the curve of infection, wages, food, and flight. And in the moment, they gave magistrates something better than fear to steer by. And there was law. Before plague, rulers promised peace and coin. After plague, they learned to govern risk, to regulate funerals and fairs, to police refuse and water, to choreograph the docks, to say not yet to a ship or a feast because the odds were wrong. Municipal health boards, maritime health statutes, cordons and quarantines, these are not pretty inventions, but they are the reason a spark does not always become a city fire. Even belief didn't stand still. Yes, there were processions and planets, penance and perfumes. But there was also a slow turn from explanations that soothe toward methods that work. Priests who shortened vigils so rooms wouldn't fill. Judges who paused processions at the peak of sickness. Households that learned to air bedding, to stand at thresholds, to leave food and keep distance. The story of the Black Death is not a triumph of medieval science. It is a record of practice, outrunning theory and dragging it forward by the sleeve. So here is the provocation, whispered so you can sleep on it. If a bacterium riding a flea could reorder law, labor, and belief, what should we be inventing now before the next perfect storm arrives? We know more than our ancestors did. We can see a microbe's genome in a day. We can move food across oceans, data across satellites, cash across phones. And still, when a new agent shows its teeth, the same old questions come to the table. Who waits? Who works? Who watches the gates? Who is left outside? The answer can't be hope. It has to be tools. What tools? Start with air. The 14th century taught us what crowded rooms do in winter. The 21st can answer with ventilation standards as serious as fire codes. Make indoor air visible real-time CO2 and filtration dashboards, not hidden machinery. That's quarantine's logic applied to buildings. Time and space manipulated until the odds improve, then signal. Medieval cities invented bills of health because rumor couldn't steer ships. We need pathogen-agnostic early warning, wastewater networks, sentinel clinics, fast tests that don't care which name a microbe prefers. Pair them with transparent dashboards written in human language. If ink once gave councils a lamp, data must do the same for neighborhoods. No mysticism, no elite gatekeeping. Add care that people can afford to obey. Quarantine islands only worked when food reached them and shelter didn't crush morale. Today that means paid sick time, bridge income, and job protection, so isolation isn't a luxury. Logistics again. Deliver basics to doors fast enough that staying home is not heroic. It's normal. Guard the information commons. The Black Death's worst reflex was scapegoating. We have louder megaphones now. We need sturdier filters. Pre-built misinformation, countermeasures, trusted community voices, pre-written message packs, rapid myth-busting that respects fear without feeding it, belong in the playbook beside masks and meds. Rehearse the boring moves. Medieval Venice learned by iteration because the sea never stops. We need drills for the dull parts, pop-up triage, surge wards that plug into ordinary hospitals without chaos, supply chains that flex without hoarding, the choreography for closing and reopening that doesn't grind the poor into paste. And remember, One Health, the interface between animals, people, and environments. The steppe rodents in burrows Matteo never saw were as much a part of his story as his own lungs. Our futures hinge on wet markets, fur farms, migration corridors, and thawing permafrost. Veterinarians and wildlife ecologists belong at the table with clinicians and mayors. Finally, protect memory. The plague taught Europe to write things down. We should do the same for lessons learned, not just losses endured. Build after-action reports that aren't shoved into drawers. Let school curricula keep a shelf for the plain mechanics of outbreaks. Make sure the next magistrate, the next nurse, the next dock worker can find the page when they need it. All of this sounds unromantic because it's about how to keep a city breathing when fear is loud. But that was always the real work. The miracle wasn't that people survived, it's that they invented survival piecemeal, provisional, sometimes cruel, often compassionate, built from rope fibers and ink and schedules and the stubborn refusal to shrug. So, take the map one last time in your hands. The red dots dim, the sea lanes calm, the ledger closes. In the quiet, ask yourself not as a riddle, but as a promise, what we will build before the next wind shifts. What island of waiting will set aside? What doorway will widen? What law will write plainly enough to obey? What rumor will smother with a better story? What breath will clear with a steady fan? And now, let the room grow still. The lesson has been said softly enough to take into sleep. Somewhere, a bell marks the hour. Somewhere, a page dries in a ledger. Somewhere, a window is cracked a hand's breadth to let winter air slide through. We have work to do. We have time to rest first.